Advancing. David is CSN's executive director. David serves as the technical coordinator for the EPA Chesapeake Bay Program's Urban Stormwater Work Group, where he leads the evaluation of new stormwater practices and approaches to reduce nutrients and sediments for the Chesapeake Bay TMDL. David has his BA in biology from St. Mary's College of Maryland. And then we also with us today have Dr. Peter Landschoot. He's an emeritus professor at Pennsylvania State University, where he served as the resident turfgrass management specialist for Penn State Extension for 35 years. Dr. Landscoot's expertise includes integrated turfgrass pest management, use of compost and soil amendments, turfgrass species and variety evaluation, and soil fertility turfgrass fertilization. His recent work focused on addressing nutrient management issues in turfgrass systems. Dr. Landschoot served on the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Urban Stormwater Rural Watershed Implementation Plan Committee, which was instrumental in developing a plan to meet the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency total maximum daily load goals for reduced nitrogen and phosphorus. He also served on the most recent expert panel to update recommendations for urban nutrient management practices in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Dr. Landschoot has his BS and MS in agronomy from Penn State University and his PhD in plant pathology from the University of Rhode Island. With that, I am going to start our recording and I will stop sharing and turn it over to David, who's going to share his screen.
All right, thank you very much, Missy. We will go ahead and get started here. Get that transitioned over. Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm glad you could make it. Glad you could join us. Looking forward to our topic today, talking all about urban nutrient management and fertilizer management, specifically in the context of the recently approved update to the Urban Nutrient Management Expert Panel report. So I'm going to go ahead and move us along to our outline for today's session. To kick us off, I want to really just set the stage a little bit. It might be old news to some of you, but I think beginning with why urban nutrient management is so important is a really good place to start. Also, make sure we're on the same page with things like terminology throughout. And then I'm going to provide some background on the history of urban nutrient management in the Chesapeake Bay restoration context, and the work that was recently completed by that new expert panel to revisit the topic. Next, I'll hand it over to Dr. Landschoot to talk in some detail about those best practices for fertilization on urban and suburban lawns. And then I'll close it out by bringing us back to that expert panel report and get into the weeds for all those things that you need to know about the BMPs in order to report them for nutrient reduction credit, if that is your interest. All right, so the need for urban nutrient management, again, just to sort of set the stage a little bit here, let me just start by clarifying that when I talk about turf and turf grass, really I'm talking about natural grass in really all of its forms. So we were talking right before the webinar. It's something that probably makes Dr. Landschoot cringe and other turf grass specialists, because if you are a turf grass specialist, turf has a very particular meaning, maybe specific to athletic fields or golf courses. But in the context of the Chesapeake Bay program and the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, turf is kind of what we've decided we call grass. It could be intensively managed, immaculate lawns, more like the, photo on the top here. It could be areas like the one on the bottom left as well that were intended to be grass, but are dealing with compaction, loss of topsoil, other issues. It doesn't have grass right now, but it was intended to be that. And so that's kind of what it gets classified as. It could be sod or from seed, but turf cover is significant from a management standpoint for us because it's greater in area actually in the Chesapeake Bay watershed than row crops are, and it's growing all the time. By recent Bay program estimates, turfgrass area is increasing at a rate of about 23,000 acres per year across the watershed. So the challenge that we have with turf from a stormwater and a water quality perspective is sort of twofold with compaction and fertilization. Turf tends to produce more runoff than a forest or a meadow condition because roots for a lot of our turf grasses are not particularly deep. We don't have as much infiltration in some cases. We also can sometimes underestimate the degree of compaction when we're doing our engineering models and things like that. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to focus mostly on the influences of fertilization on nutrient losses. So, where do these turf nutrients come from that we're, losing and causing water quality problems? Mostly, again, it's going to come from lawn fertilizers. Along with atmospheric deposition, lawn fertilizer is really the other leading source of urban nutrients in the Bay watershed. So again, in the stormwater sector, we're talking about, lawns, more highly developed areas. People for years and years have been putting fertilizers down in their grass to keep it greener, to keep it healthier. And it's important, it works. But you can have too much of a good thing. So the grass's roots, they'll drink up the nitrogen that it needs. If you apply more than the grass needs, though, it tends to hang out until it washes away. So, or leaches out or some other loss mechanism. So, in some ways, the good news here is that application rates are actually decreasing across the watershed due to state fertilizer legislation, as well as other restrictions around fertilizer use in terms of when and where and how it's applied, which we're going to get into a little bit later. All right, so speaking of those lost pathways, how do we lose these fertilizer nutrients that we put down on our lawns and on our grasses? I talked a little bit about compaction and erosion, but these are really the lost pathways. So for phosphorus, some urban soils might be saturated with respect to phosphorus, either because they've been fertilized for many years, or because they reflect, the legacy of past farming activities on those lands. In those conditions, the soluble phosphorus can leave the soil and surface runoff without sediment. Phosphorus loss can also occur when phosphorus attached to sediment particles and organic matter is exported or lost in surface runoff. The loss is greatest, the potential is greatest when the grass is dormant, particularly when soils are frozen. So studies have found, losses sharply increase as phosphorus fertilization application rates increase. But we do lose a certain amount just kind of independent of fertilizer application as well. Nitrogen, nitrate leaching can be a significant source of nitrogen export under certain lawn conditions. It's dependent on things like the soil type, irrigation, the grass species, rooting depth, how much you fertilize and when you fertilize. Nitrate leaching is usually greatest during seasons of the year, again, when the grass is dormant. But again, it can be influenced by things like application rate, type of fertilizer, and things like that. All right, so what do we do about it? Putting together kind of what we know about, those concerns and our lost pathways, what are the options that we have for better urban fertilizer management? So we could put legislation together that restricts the sale or the over application of a particular nutrient that might be overabundant, like phosphorus. We can test our soil and develop nutrient management plans to sort of better target the needs of a particular area of lawn or turf. We can manage our grass clippings. There is a lot of organic nutrients in those grass clippings, and thinking about what we do with it and how we manage that grass can make a big difference in terms of what we're losing from nutrients from our lawns. And then, of course, we can implement better education programs to let our community members know, landscape businesses as well, who do a lot of the care for our lawns and turf about what those fertilizer best practices are. All right, so that brings us to our Urban Nutrient Management Expert Panel. The Bay program basically wanted to, years ago, capture those benefits with official best management practices or BMPs. So a panel was originally formed back in 2013, or it was formed in 2011 and finished in 2013, to really dig into those interventions that I just mentioned to determine if there was enough evidence to support what we would call a creditable practice or a series of BMPs that you could claim as nutrient reductions under the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load or TMDL framework. So what they came up with at that time was a series of three different BMPs, or I guess two and a half, depending on how you want to kind of lump them together. There was a legislative credit where a statewide reduction in nutrients was applied for all states just based on the fact that legislation had been passed to phase out phosphorus or to limit the sale of phosphorus in lawn maintenance products. There was also nutrient management plan BMPs. Basically, if you implemented an urban nutrient management plan on a high risk lawn, you got a certain amount of reduction, or on a lower risk lawn, you got a little bit less credit. There was also credit specific to Maryland for nitrogen legislation that was unique to Maryland at the time. They were the only ones that had passed legislation addressing nitrogen. So the big takeaway here, was one, the panel knew the factors that could determine export risk, things like high water tables, exposed soils, compacted soils, but they weren't necessarily, if and how the states were going to actually measure those risk factors. Second, the legislation banning phosphorus in lawn maintenance fertilizer products was pretty much brand new at the time. Some industry data had suggested that companies were going to begin phasing out phosphorus as a result of the legislation, but the panel set up that statewide legislation credit really as a temporary one, based on an estimate with the goal of eventually using annual sales data of these lawn fertilizers as the basis for the actual nutrient reductions. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but I do think it's helpful in kind of understanding the broad context of what we're going to be talking about when I talk about these BMPs and the credit that's earned. Just to put in a little bit of context for how we measure fertilizer and the Chesapeake Bay modeling tools. I'm just going to start big picture with the graphic on the left here. This is called the CAST structure, the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool. It's functionally the Bay model. Broken into its simple elements, it's a combination of inputs, land management actions, and natural processes that deliver pollutants to the bay. Fertilizer management is measured mostly through inputs. How much do you apply? And land management, how much turf is there, and how much do you manage with BMPs to reduce what's lost to receiving waters? So we'll talk about the BMPs later, but on the urban side, we measure the inputs by gathering data from a group called APCO, the American Association of Plant Food Control Officers, plus data that's provided by each of the states in the Bay watershed, usually from their ag agencies, on how many pounds of fertilizer nutrients are sold in any given year. We gather up all of those pounds of sales. We count them at a county scale. We remove any, outliers in those data sets to try to just smooth it a little bit so that the trends make more sense from year to year and we don't get these wild spikes up and down. And then we distribute it, evenly across the turf grass acres on a state by state basis. So that's basically the primary way that we establish sort of the baseline amount of nutrients that we're applying in a given year to our lawns and turf grass acres. That's kind of the basic premise here. All right, so that brings us to why we needed to then revisit our Urban Nutrient Management Expert Panel report. So again, over 10 years had gone by since that last panel had come up with its recommendations. So it was a time for an update. So they wanted to look at these couple of issues as their primary charge. There's a few other bullets, but these are kind of the crux of what they wanted to evaluate. They wanted to look at the effectiveness of state fertilizer legislation. One, do the trends in sales kind of reflect decreases that we would expect following the passing of legislation? And two, is there, other evidence in the scientific literature on studies that, from other areas of the country that have done, legislative changes in terms of nutrients and seen how effective they were? Look at options and implications for providing nutrient reductions for large non-fertilized lands. So think about maybe institutional campuses or certain federal facilities where there's large areas of grass that have to be maintained, but they're not maintaining them with fertilizer inputs. They're kind of left alone to their own devices. Right now, that method that I just talked about, the way that it works is we don't know which acres do and do not receive nutrients. You don't know whether your neighbor's lawn did or you did, at least from the data that we have at the Bay program. So it's just assumed to be spread evenly across those acres. And so, how do we incentivize those properties that are taking good care of their lawns, but they're not putting any fertilizer down? We wanted to evaluate the potential approaches to streamline how this data are tracked and reported and then verified, particularly for those individual nutrient management plans, and then look at any feedback on the nutrient application and physical process simulation that's kind of happening in the back end of the model. I'm not going to get into really much of that today. So this was the star-studded panel that we pulled together for this work. It was a mix of representatives from local government and state government, folks that work in the data collection side of, some of those fertilizer sales data, as well as folks that work in academia as turfgrass specialists or at extension agencies as well, including Dr. Landschoot. We pulled together this membership through the Bay Program's Urban Stormwater Work Group, made sure we kind of balanced out that membership, and then started meeting back in September of 2024, meeting about 7 times over the course of the year. That panel really started out by kind of reviewing the existing 2013 report, the literature review that they conducted, which was very extensive, as well as any new updates to some of the models and data that might have been updated over the years. Then we looked at a literature review as well. Again, just kind of taking a fresh look at some of those papers that the 2013 panel had pulled together, as well as any new papers that had been published over the last 10 years. So in total, that came to about 40 new peer-reviewed papers. I'm going to walk through some of those findings real quickly before I turn it over to Dr. Landschoot to talk about some of the best practices. I'm going to start with legislation, the review of the effectiveness of the fertilizer legislation. So really, again, I sort of alluded to this a minute ago. When the 2013 panel was put together, Maryland, New York, Virginia, and the District of Columbia had enacted legislation to address urban nutrients and fertilizers. The legislation covered a range of different elements. And then, I should mention too that Pennsylvania, since then, the last expert panel report back in 2022, passed their own legislation. Those, covered anything from full-on bans of phosphorus in lawn maintenance fertilizer, which was true for Maryland, New York, Virginia, and now Pennsylvania, to other restrictions on the rates, timing, and placement of fertilizer. So that can be labeling requirements. It can be maximum nitrogen application rates. It can be exemptions for certain specialty products. It can be bans on winter application, prohibiting where you place it, putting fertilizer too close to a surface water or paved surface. So, these laws cover quite a few different things. So, the panel also looked at kind of in this review, aside from updating kind of the tracking of what's on the books, they did look at literature from other areas of the country. The best study out there really was from Minnesota, which was actually available at the time of the 2013 panel, looking at Minnesota's phosphorus ban, which found that legislation was effective at reducing the amount of phosphorus applied in the coverage area by about 48% in the first 3 years of that legislation. There were some localized county level improvements seen in Snohomish County, Washington. In Florida, some fertilizer ordinances differed a lot by locality, but the studies concluded that water quality trends did improve in regions with winter ordinances in place. So there's a range of different things, but there is also some evidence that the panel found to suggest that resident awareness of some of this legislation is not, it's not penetrating deeply into kind of the awareness of most communities. A study in Maryland, found that in a survey of about 3,800 households, only just under 3% indicated they were highly aware of the Maryland lawn fertilizer law, which is this legislation that's in the table here on the left-hand column. So there's still some work to do, even with the legislation in place, particularly around things like the rate and the timing and the placement, where we can probably work to continue to improve awareness. Now, the other piece of this, aside from looking at the literature, was to look at these trends in sales, because the panel really felt that the best way to capture the impact of particularly the bans, but really if there's legislation on how much you can use in terms of rates and things like that, you're going to see that bared out in sales data and these state by state trends. So I'm just going to draw your attention here to the red and blue numbers at the bottom of this table because there's a lot of numbers here. Um, the red is total nitrogen, the blue is total phosphorus. The number on the left is 2006, and then 2020 is on the right. And so, you can see that, trends for total nitrogen showed about a 38% decline in total nitrogen sales over that time period. Total phosphorus data sets also showed declining sales trends. This was backed up both in the sales data reported by the states, which is what this data set's showing, but for phosphorus, we also had data from some private sector companies as well, kind of industry data that showed similar trends. It was actually even more of a phase out than this. So again, sort of seeing that even in states where the legislation wasn't passed, the kind of industry-wide phase out of phosphorus and some of these products in particular led to declining trends in sales. Just two other quick slides before I turn it over to Dr. Landschoot. Just wanted to mention a couple other findings around phosphorus from the literature review portion of the panel's work. And really, you'll see this for both nitrogen and phosphorus. The new papers, there's 40 new papers that I mentioned, largely reinforced, the phosphorus dynamics that were outlined in that 2013 expert panel report. Really that, urban and suburban lawns are largely retentive of phosphorus. There was a, handful of papers that showed phosphorus losses ranged from, less than 1% to about 18%, kind of depending on the turf grass conditions and the fertilizer timings. A newer study supported that general range with the loss looking more like 4 to 6% in that study. So again, kind of in that same ballpark. It also, reaffirmed that the key factors contributing to phosphorus loss were primarily, hydrologic factors that increase runoff losses, things like compaction and frozen soils and high intensity rainfall events, steep slopes, even connection to high density impervious cover. So lawn areas that are kind of otherwise surrounded or adjacent to pavement. There has been some work on, recent studies focusing on localized hotspots, things like home and community gardens and urban farms that might be nutrient inefficient, but that we don't really capture as separate from lawns in terms of how they're simulated. So, something to look into in the future, but a little bit outside of the scope to kind of dig into that with this particular work. On the nitrogen side, sort of a similar story, again, largely reinforcing those dynamics from the 2013 report. There was a little bit more work looking at interdisciplinary studies. How do human behavior kind of factor in to some of the nitrogen dynamics in particular. I mentioned the study kind of looking at awareness of homeowners of some of the legislation and what those best practices are. Most of the fertilizer, again, was retained in urban lawns that were monitored in Baltimore. So 75% of fertilizer nitrogen was retained in one study in Baltimore. Others found, loss of nitrogen fertilizer to be, again, just about 1 to 5%. So they're not super leaky. The factors that influence it can be more of these hotspots where you have things like high water tables or bare soils and things like that, proximity to those impervious areas. So those are some of the things. Even age of the lawn is kind of being seen as increasingly important. Newly established lawns, kind of when you're still building up the turf health, and then lawns that are 20 plus years old, maybe exhibiting some of the greatest risks of export. So again, just factors to consider in the management and development of things like more tailored nutrient management plans. All right, so with that, I'm going to pause myself and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Landschoot. I'm going to bring up his slides really quick and share those with you all. All right. Look good?
Okay. Well, thank you, David. And good afternoon, everyone. As David said, I'm going to spend a few minutes going over some of the best lawn management practices for lawns in the Bay Watershed. And David, you can move on. I'm just going to give you a hands up for moving on. Okay. The preview of topics that I'm going to be discussing start with some of the assumptions that the panel made regarding nutrient losses and management focus areas. And then I'll move on to the current core urban nutrient management best practices, which would include nitrogen rate, timing, location, and also clipping management. And when I'm going to cover these areas, I'm also going to be talking about phosphorus fertilization. Even though there is a ban on phosphorus, there is still some applications where phosphorus is allowed now. And as we go through this presentation, I'd also like to add a few comments about the role of extension in promoting and disseminating information on urban nutrient management best practices. There are some differences among universities and what we suggest, and some challenges in getting the information out of there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Okay, you can move back one. Okay, nope, back. Okay, the assumptions that the panel made were that urban and suburban lawns are largely retentive of nutrients, particularly N, and David just mentioned that. And that losses do occur, particularly for N, are mostly driven by what we refer to as hot spots and hot moments. Now, what do we mean by that? We're referring to locations in the landscape, such as compacted soil, steep slopes, and hot moments, which could be time of the year where you apply fertilizer, or maybe before certain types of weather events. And then management to reduce water quality impacts should focus on fertilizer rate, timing, and placement, as well as grass clipping management. So the core turf, nitrogen, and phosphorus fertilizer and clipping best management practices that we proposed, actually there were three of them. I'm going to be mostly focusing on best management practice one and two. The third one involves lawns that are not fertilized. So best management practice one is urban nutrient management plan with a soil test. And this refers to nutrient reductions for written urban nutrient management plans developed by trained experts based on soil tests. Best management practice two is urban nutrient management plans without a soil test. The core practices are basically the same as best management practice one, but with some minor modifications to account for the lack of soil testing. Okay, starting off with rate practices. So for both best management practice one and two, we're talking about nitrogen here. Application of nitrogen is in alignment with extension guidelines. And keep in mind that we don't test for nitrogen in soil tests that go for practitioners, homeowners. Nitrogen is very mobile in the soil, as most of you know, and you can get a value for nitrogen, but it's basically meaningless with respect to management. Extension guidelines. Okay, so we originally had extension recommendations, and I just wanted to mention that we changed recommendations to guidelines, and that was mostly based on input from myself. Our university a few years ago decided that we're not going to use recommendations as a term in our extension publications anymore. That was brought on by one of the deans I think there are some implications for recommendations which might bring up some legal concerns. I'm not really sure why they decided this, but guidelines, I think, is a better term to use because it implies less rigidity in what we're promoting and trying to get people to follow. A lot of different scenarios for lawns where recommendations sometimes could use a little bit of um, maybe flexibility. Best management practice one, now we're talking about phosphorus. This would be in accordance with soil needs established by a soil test, including during establishment and repair. Now, typically when you get a soil test for phosphorus, you're getting a recommendation for phosphorus to be tilled into the soil, in addition to a general recommendation for phosphorus in starter fertilizer. BMP2 would be no application of phosphorus for established lawns. Now, there are some allowances for this. One of them is for establishment. Even without a soil test, most legislation now allows for starter fertilizer, which contains phosphorus, to help the turf get established, to get cover around the ground very quickly. New roots need a little bit more phosphorus up at the surface. So that exception is made in most of the legislation now, which is around the bay. And repair follows the same general practice. So yes, you can use phosphorus under certain circumstances, but generally speaking, no application for established lawns. One of the next core practices includes timing practices. This is pretty important with respect to fertilization and the potential for losses in the environment. Our recommendation is to avoid applications of N or P outside of the growing season. And I think the dates of October 31st and March 1st are pretty reasonable for lawns. And you get some argument from athletic field managers, but really what we're talking about here are lawns. Generally speaking, the turf slows down, doesn't produce much vegetative growth in late October, and doesn't really start again until we get well into March. Apply slow release fertilizers for nitrogen. And there are a lot of choices of slow release fertilizers out on the market now. Things like sulfur coated urea, which is SCU. Polymer coated urea is becoming very popular now in the lawn care industry. You'll see a lot more of that being applied, especially by lawn care companies. Methylene ureas is contained in a lot of home lawn fertilizers, and of course, organic fertilizers. Now, natural organic fertilizers do contain some phosphorus. Most legislation now allows for some natural organic fertilizer to be applied, but with limits. I also wanted to mention that when it comes to putting down slow release nitrogen fertilizers, a lot of these products contain some readily available nitrogen. So that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about slow release nitrogen sources. What is the product and how much soluble nitrogen is also contained in that product? Apply nitrogen at annual rates suggested by extension. Again, I use the word suggested here. There's a wide range in annual rates that are recommended depending on the use of the turf, the type of turf you're using, the time of the year. But one key component of this is to split these applications over maybe 2 or 3 applications and apply these during the growing season when you're getting active growth, especially root growth. Now, this would be in the spring and the fall. Typically, we suggest not applying fertilizer in the middle of the summer when the turf is under heat and drought stress, and also when turf is beginning to slow down in late fall through the winter and even in early spring before you're starting to get active growth again. And to avoid nitrogen and phosphorus applications within 48 hours prior to runoff-inducing rainfall or irrigation events. And this suggestion was put forth by Denise, one of our panel members for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Prior to coming up with this language, it was avoid applications 48 hours prior to rainfall or irrigation events. It's really important to water in fertilizer lightly so that it gets into the thatch and down into the root zone before you may encounter a runoff-inducing event. Sometimes fertilizer is left on the surface during the heat and drought of summer, and you lose quite a bit of nitrogen through volatilization too. So that's why we put in runoff-inducing rainfall or irrigation. You want to water the fertilizer in, but not excessively. Okay, and that brings us to location practices. I believe this practice was in the last 2013 core management practices. Avoid application of nitrogen or phosphorus within 15 to 20 feet of a water feature. This is pretty self-explanatory. We're talking about streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, any body of water. And also to avoid application of nitrogen or phosphorus to impervious surfaces. A lot of fertilizer does get put down on impervious surfaces inadvertently. And when that happens, you definitely want to either broom it back onto the turf or blow it back onto the turf. This is something that really needs to be promoted more so, I think, especially among homeowners that leave a lot of granules on impervious surfaces. You also want to avoid severely compacted soils or steep slopes with applications. I put a couple of photographs down here. Down at the bottom left, this was a stage shot at Longwood Gardens. I asked the manager to do something incorrectly, and that is to, for the purposes of taking a photograph, run the fertilizer spreader along an impervious surface. This is something we don't want applicators to do. We want to start your first pass well away from the impervious surface so the granules coming out of one side of that spreader do not get down on the impervious surface. Try to hit that a lot during my extension publications and presentations. The center slide shows a deflector on a rotary spreader. And there are some cases where some companies now are using these to avoid getting fertilizer granules into the street and the sidewalks. They add these deflectors, which can be moved in or out depending on how you want to make your application. And so it's a nice feature to put on a rotary spreader. And the third is basically someone blowing off leaves and fertilizer granules after an application. A couple of photographs here of severely compacted soils. This is one of the things that kind of drives me nuts in my extension program is a lot of times turf managers, homeowners don't really have a lot of say in how the soils are prepared prior to the deposition of topsoil and seed. A lot of the soils are mistreated during the construction process for new homes. This is a rather extreme example, obviously, but they're severely compacted, and then a very small amount of topsoil is placed on the surface. And then you're expected to have a dense, healthy lawn after that is basically the soil is destroyed. One thing I would recommend, even though we discourage application of nitrogen and phosphorus to severely compacted soils, there are some things you can do to decompact the soil, such as really aggressive core aeration, maybe putting down some organic amendments or additional topsoil, and then do some seeding and then put some fertilizer down once the surface of the soil has become decompacted. Steep slopes are another issue we try to hit in some of our extension programs. I would advocate for a slope that's greater than 15% to either terrace it and put ornamental plantings in, or to plant some kind of a ground cover like Pachysandra or periwinkle on a steep slope, such as shown in this slide to the right, or to just let the grass grow. And there are a lot of cases where when I was working at Penn State, we would suggest putting down fine fescues and just not mow them and let the grass lay over. And that would basically alleviate the need for any fertilizer applications on these steep slopes. So there's a lot of things you can do, um, but we just try to get away from putting fertilizer down and mowing these kind of things. All right, and that brings us to the last practice, which is clipping management practices. Here we're trying to retrain grass clippings and mulch leaves on turf and keep them out of streets and storm drains. And this is an area that really needs some consumer education. As I walk around neighborhoods in the spring, especially in the spring, I see homeowners, which are mostly doing the mowing, as well as professional mowing companies, just blowing the grass clippings out into the streets. And there's just not a whole lot of information available to try to discourage homeowners and professionals to not do that. We have a lot of information on fertilizer practices, but not much on grass clipping practices. So this is an area that I think really needs to be developed in extension and at the state level as well. Set mower heights at 3 inches or higher. This is kind of common sense. Most people are doing this now, I think. But we do need to make adjustments for certain types of turf. For Bermuda grass, for example, just you don't want to be mowing this at 3 inches in height. But for most of our cool season grasses, 3 inches is appropriate. There are some situations where cultural practices are employed when we do renovation practices, such as dethatching, aeration. One of the suggestions we make is to mow the turf down to about 1 inch in height before you do any renovation practices. That allows better seed development and less interference from practices like aeration and dethatching. Also, sometimes the phase of establishment will govern the height of mowing. For example, sometimes during the early stages of establishment, you want to get out and mow the grass down a little bit lower than 3 inches. This allows some more of the seed to germinate and establish, and it prevents the grass from laying over and getting crushed whenever traffic is placed on it. Okay, so I just wanted to throw a couple of additional comments in here as well. I spent the bulk of my career in an extension position, and it's towards the end of my tenure at Penn State, I saw some things that were a little disturbing, and that is extension being under some financial strains and more positions being converted over to teaching, and some of the extension responsibilities being taken away, positions at the county level where someone retires not being replaced again. And even though I think in Chesapeake Bay Watershed, extension is still fairly robust going forward, I think there are some trends that are a little bit disturbing. We have currently at Penn State 3 positions open now in turf extension. Hopefully, at least 2 of these are going to be refilled, but I'm just hopeful, but I'm not exactly sure how much of this is going to involve turf extension. The bottom line here is that may impact availability of research-based information and dissemination in the future. Basic information is out there, but in the future, we're going to need more information on nutrient-efficient turfgrass species and cultivars, such as the new tall fescues, which are more nutrient efficient, new fertilizer technology, that may be coming along, and nutrient needs assessments. And this would be things like soil test calibration. Um, Very, very strong need for more soil test calibration studies to be done and more surveys as to how much grass really needs with respect to phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen. That's all I had to discuss today. If anybody has any comments or questions, I'll try to take these as we go along.
Thanks, Peter. I know that there are a couple in the Q&A that would be great for you maybe take a look at, and then we can get to them if we have time at the end, or we can put in some answers. I'm going to go ahead and pull my slides back up just to take us through the end of the presentation as we roll along. Right. Okay, so now we get into the fun part, which is the credit tracking, reporting, and verification for those of you, particularly who work in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but for those of you who don't, maybe this is of interest just to kind of see what things are looking like around here. So I'll just start. Peter mentioned that there were 3 individual BMPs established as part of these recommendations. He talked about kind of the core practices that underpinned the first 2 BMPs. So I'll talk about those again a little bit, and then get into the non-fertilized turf grass BMP as well. So again, just to summarize quickly, the first best management practice is for the Urban Nutrient Management Plan that was established based on a soil test. The second is an urban nutrient management plan developed without a soil test. And then the third is non-fertilized turf grass. You can see the associated nutrient reductions and the duration or the length of that credit. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar, the credit duration is basically if you report that you implemented an urban nutrient management plan on so many acres of lawn. If you reported that first BMP, you used a soil test as the basis for that plan, those reductions would be good for 3 years, and then you would need to, retest the soil and, develop an updated plan. If you did not use a soil test, that would last for a year, and then you would have to re-report that record again the following year. So that's kind of the basis here. For those who are, looking to kind of compare how this stacks up with the previous recommendations from the 2013 report, the reduction percentages are pretty similar. The 6% reduction is pretty much in line with what was the rate for low risk lawns in the 2013 report. The 4.5% is in line with what was called the blended reduction rate in the previous version, which is kind of, we didn't know if it was a high risk or a low risk. So it's kind of in the middle of the two. So just for those who are looking to kind of see the comparison. All right, so for the first BMP, again, these are just, I'll call these the qualifying criteria, kind of the core components here. Peter alluded to some of these. I'm not going to talk in more detail about the core best practices again, but these plans should be written by a trained professional or a trained expert. So that could be a certified plan writer or applicator. It can be determined, who is a trained professional is allowed to be determined by each state. But it could, include certified nutrient management planners or applicators. It could be extension agency partners. It could be, staff at your state agency who, understand how to, or local agency who understand how to interpret a soil test result and receive training on and are well versed in these, core best practices. So that can be determined if you work for a state. You just kind of have to lay out what your criteria are going to be. You would put that in your quality assurance plan for the Bay program. The soil tests that it is based on, we also talked about how we define what a soil test is in this context. And so for this BMP, it is soil test analysis that is conducted by an accredited lab. And it should, have the basics for a soil test that includes at a minimum phosphorus, potassium, and pH. If you want to do other things, that's fine, but this is kind of the basics for a standard soil test. And then you follow those best practices. The other thing that is relevant here is that this BMP is appropriate for, states that have and implement a certified applicator program like exists in the state of Maryland, where there is training that's done to you know, inform applicators of these best practices for rate, timing, location, those kinds of things. And then they conduct, verification, and they receive reports of, acres of lawns that are covered by these landscaping companies on an annual basis. Like they can report those records under this BMP because under the conditions of those programs, they receive the appropriate training and testing that's being done to kind of qualify here. That's specifically kind of to draw a contrast to this, second BMP, which again, same best practices for an urban nutrient management plan without a soil test, but it does lack that test or a formal plan that's developed by that trained professional. What this really does is it captures homeowner pledges, pledge programs. There have been some states and some localities that have invested quite a lot, in partnership with their extension agencies or regional partners to put together education and outreach materials and, set up stands at community events or, going door to door or whatever that happens to be and provide education on these core best practices and get a signed pledge from a homeowner to follow them. And then they get take home materials and then they hopefully adhere to them. Because the best practices are the same, the nutrient reductions are the same. But the difference here is that there is a little bit less confidence in place, right? Because there's not a soil test as a basis. And that homeowner, despite receiving the educational materials, doesn't have the same level of training. So these pledges last for just a year instead of 3 years like the previous BMP. So this is the kind of thing that if you do this with homeowners, you would kind of need to be following up on an annual basis to kind of get recommitments from those folks. And then the third practice is these large non-fertilized turf grass acres. So they're for properties that are effectively managed. They have healthy grass that are designed. They're maintained to reduce nutrient export, but without the use of fertilizer. So they have to be actively managed, meaning they can't be successional. Maybe they're under a mow only designation or something like that. But again, I mentioned this earlier. This is significant because that the Chesapeake Bay model applies fertilizer to all turf acres equally. So this provides an incentive or a benefit for those properties that are not applying fertilizer. Now the key thing here is that you do have to still have someone whose job it is. There's a signed commitment by the owner or the property manager to adhere to that lack of fertilizer application and to the core set of clipping management practices that Dr. Landschoot talked about earlier. This way you can make sure that the turf, remains healthy. You kind of do have to do a little bit more on the verification side to make sure that, particularly the turf, remains in good coverage. You have the absence of exposed soils, because you can't just be hands off and kind of let the turf die off and create these bare spots and things like that, because there are instances where fertilizer can help ensure that the lawn remains healthy and strong. So this works for certain properties and I think might be specific to certain cases. All right, now quickly, I'm gonna, in case that wasn't in the weeds enough, I'm gonna address a couple quick things for those who are reporting these BMPs to the Bay program. I recommend folks be prepared with your spreadsheets, your acronym dictionaries, and pocket protectors and whatever else you might need to proceed from here. But basically, if you want to report these practices, you have the name of the BMP that you are reporting. So it's the nutrient management plan with a soil test, without a soil test, or non-fertilized turf. You, report the number of acres that qualify under that BMP, and then where it's located. There are certain geography, scales that you can report at. Obviously, if you know the latitude and longitude, that's wonderful. A lot of times we get these at the county scale or even at a state scale in some cases. The date that the plan was implemented or signed, depending on the circumstance. And then in this case, you can report a land use as well, 90% of the time, that's probably going to be what's just called our turf grass land use. Although there might be limited instances where it could be applied on tree canopy over turf grass, or newly going forward, solar development sites in the pervious areas. Couple of questions that we wanted to address that are kind of frequently asked questions in terms of, can you combine the different BMPs? Jurisdictions can report other stormwater practices on the same acre that's covered by a nutrient management plan. They would just kind of work almost like a treatment train. But obviously, based on the differences in the definitions here, you can't report multiple nutrient management BMPs on the same acre, because you can't be not fertilizing and also fertilizing at the same time. So that's kind of the basis there. A couple other quick ones that I wanted to get through. I promise I only have 2 slides left. Are jurisdictions eligible for those statewide nutrient reduction credits if they have legislation? I expect to get this one a lot because of that temporary credit that the 2013 panel set up. So the answer is no. There's no additional statewide BMP reduction that's provided for states that have fertilizer legislation. The big thing here is that, since about 2017, tracking of reductions that are associated with the fertilizer legislation is all handled as an input rather than kind of a BMP, meaning that all of that data that I mentioned that we're tracking from APCO and the state reported fertilizer sales, that lowers the kind of load of fertilizers being applied. So you're sort of seeing those benefits, you're just seeing them in a different part of the model as opposed to kind of in the BMP ledger. Homeowner pledges are eligible, as long as they are signed and they adhere to the best practices. Those recommendations, these BMPs, because they are replacing a previous set, these will take effect whenever the Chesapeake Bay Program's Phase 7 model takes effect. They are eligible to be reported now, but for those of you who use the lingo, they are planning BMPs at this point. So that, once Phase 7 gets turned on, they will get credit. That might not be until 2029 or 2030. In the meantime, you can still report the old BMPs in Phase 6, but I would suggest you begin transitioning if you are planning to do so. Last thing I wanted to touch on is just the tracking, reporting, and verification component of this. The report, the full expert panel report, does have some more details on all of these things, so I'm not going to go into super deep depth here. But on the legislation side, verification is happening through that sales data. States are going to continue to document, these trends in annual nitrogen and phosphorus sales as we move forward. That's going to continue to be done on an annual basis. There are some suggestions for visual indicators that you can use for turf health. I think, as I mentioned, it can be particularly helpful for the non-fertilized turf practices, but I think it can work in nutrient management plan contexts as well, including some, suggested thresholds around ground cover and density, signs of plant stress, and surface compaction, as well as, it can be a visual as well. There are some recommended, record keeping requirements, making sure that you have records on those nutrient management plans, contact information for whoever developed the plan or whoever is managing that property, so that you have a way, especially if you want to re-up some of these credits in the long run, you have sort of a contact database that you can reach out to. Procedures for how decisions are made if you need to do a follow-up inspection, if they're, this might be particularly applicable if you have like a certified applicator program. You're getting kind of large data sets of, acreage is covered by a particular landscaping company or something like that. How do you know that something is worth a follow-up inspection? Just kind of having that process documented. What the application rates are for those properties if they are being done kind of at a lump scale, and then information on the soil tests and the present risk factors. There's also some information if you're doing these at a large scale and you're interested in kind of doing a statistical subsampling approach. This has been done in the agricultural context in some cases, and there are some areas that have looked at in New York doing statistical subsampling as a method for some stormwater practices as well. So basically, you can use a random subsampling of fertilizer applicators or landscape managers, and you can use that based on a statistical significance to extrapolate that compliance to the community as a whole. So just some ideas there. These are a really difficult set of practices to inspect and verify. Obviously, if they're only reported annually, it's less of a factor because the year goes by and then it just rolls off the books anyway. But for those kind of 3-year plans or things like that, you still want to have a process in place if you do need to do a follow-up and make sure that they're being adhered to. All right, and that's it. That brings us to the end. Sorry, we're a couple minutes over. I know there's a couple questions in the chat and in the Q&A. I don't know if we've had a chance to answer any of those or if we want to get to a few of those, Missy, before we let folks go.
Yeah, it looks like we haven't answered any, but yeah, so if anybody has to go, totally understand. We are still recording, so we'll have a recording of the questions that we are answering. This will be posted on our website. It'll also be posted on our YouTube channel as well. So if you have to go, that's fine. You could also email me. I have my email in the chat there, and then I can get answers for you as well if you have a different question. Okay, so let's just jump right into some of these. We actually had one person asking about was climate change considered when this was rewritten. So frequency and intensity of precipitation, was that taken into effect?
It wasn't explicitly addressed in the reductions, but I will say that it is something that is factored in to the Bay Program modeling when they're looking at future scenarios to kind of look at future hydrologies. So to the extent that, changing conditions are influencing the intensity of rainfall and, runoff and things like that, that's kind of accounted for through different climate scenarios because fertilizer inputs are handled kind of and distributed across those the model, you capture kind of increases in nutrient loads that might result from that kind of at a larger scale external to this particular report. So that's kind of the way I would say it's being addressed more broadly.
Excellent. We have a question for Dr. Landschoot. It says, you mentioned the polymer slow release fertilizer is getting popular. Has tackling an old environmental problem created a new environmental problem with this?
You mean the residual from the coating, the plastics that break down? Is that what I
I think
assume
so,
that's what
yeah. Yeah.
I assume that's what the question refers to. Um, I haven't studied this. I know this question has come up from time to time. The industry is trying to deal with that by making compounds which are biodegradable. I've worked with a couple of companies that tried some things like soy-based coatings on a base that would break down. Um, but I have not explored this. I just want to say I haven't explored this in too much detail, so I don't know what the environmental implications are for these plastics that are residual in the soil. They are in the soil, though. Let's say that.
We actually have another kind of similar one. If we're using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer that has slow release, do we need to do split applications? So an example is Ribosorb that Dr. Charlie White at Penn State said reduces phosphorus by 50% with the same result as traditional fertilizer in split applications.
Yes, I would say generally speaking, you split applications are recommended even with slow release fertilizers. With with respect to nitrogen, there are products. There's one I can think of right off the top of my head called Spread It and Forget It, where it's made up of a kind of a combination of different fertilizers with different release rates. You put it down at a really high rate, and it's supposed to release gradually over the entire season. I haven't seen too many people have bought into that approach. Um, so by far, the most used slow release fertilizers are those that release over a period of several weeks, and then you put down another application later in the year. So I would say at least two split applications or two applications over the course of the year for most slow release fertilizers. Yeah.
Excellent. And this question is there any indication that this UNM reboot will change rules for phase two MS4 permits, especially in Virginia?
I think it's unlikely. I think that most of the reporting methods are going to remain pretty consistent. Virginia DEQ was, a member of the panel, so we were kind of working with them as well. It mostly would just influence the way that, kind of tracking and reporting of those plans is being done potentially. But I haven't heard any indication that they're planning to make major changes to anything as a result of the new recommendations. Hopefully, guidance will be updated and, ways of kind of, doing those kinds of things might, be updated, but I don't think there will be major programmatic changes.
Okay, and we have another one. If UNM is reported, it appears the reduction poofs the nutrients rather than reallocates the stock of fertilizer from state APCO data. This is different than the agricultural NM BMP. Was this sector difference discussed?
So we did coordinate to a certain extent with the some folks that worked on the agriculture and nutrient management side of things. The scale and the scope is very different, but between them, I think the way that the changes in application are being tracked kind of through that sales data is pretty similar now to the way that they're handling it in ag. The BMP is a little bit different, but in terms of total acres under the individual nutrient management plans, it's a relatively small coverage area, and the efficiency reduction has kind of been the consistent way that the urban sector has handled those BMPs over time. So I think that was part of the consideration too, that maintaining consistency to a certain extent with the previous recommendations was going to be valuable to folks.
Okay, excellent. And I really appreciate you guys hanging on for a little while. Thank you very much. Sorry we ran over, but again, if you weren't able to watch it, you can watch the answers later on. They're all going to be posted on our YouTube channel along with all of our past webinars as well. So thank you guys. Thank you, Dr. Landschoot. Thank you, David. And we hope to see you guys again on our next webinar, which will be coming up next week. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.